Welcome to Legacy Conversations, a channel where we preserve military memories and history.
Hello everyone, welcome back. This is episode 2 of many. And I'm really enjoying these conversations. I hope you do too. Please spread the word. We have here Commandant Atzpies of the South African Air Force. Fascinating man. He flew many of the aircraft which I really has a sincere interest in. There are many stories which he's been spreading around. A lot of those stories are also in his books. And yes, we're going to talk about the books as well. But right now, I asked the Colonel, for you people who don't understand, the Commandant in the South African Defence Force in the old days would be a Lieutenant Colonel today. So I asked the Colonel of a Commandant, I asked him to just tell us about his career first, and thereafter we'll start talking about the stories of a SAF, the things you need to know, and we will start going into his time in Rhodesia as a policeman, but that was on a cover flying, of course, as a pilot and navigator. I'm not sure if he was a navigator there, we'll find out. Also flying this intelligent gathering type of aircraft. Very harsh, let me tell you. But we stopped last time where he went from a navigator and he did the course to become a pilot in the South African Air Force. Now, guys, we've spoken here to a few pilots already, and they will tell you that is tough. And I got the feeling when they were talking to me, and perhaps the Commandant can confirm or deny, is that the student pilot isn't really the most respected thing in the Air Force. It seems to me that you have to pay the price. You will not become an Air Force pilot in this country unless you are really good at what you do. And they are merciless. They fear, but they are merciless. If you can't make it, they're going to wash you out. But at some stage, you've got to make it. And you're going to fly around solo. It's a very big deal. And once you have landed again, your mates are waiting for you. And perhaps you can tell us the story further, where they assaulted you most brutally and kidnapped you, I would say, in law, and then they dumped you onto an ice pond.
You want to talk about the time that I went solo? Now, the first thing that you do, they decide, okay, you're good enough. So the instructor gets out at the back and he removes his stick at the back. That one, his control stick, that one can be removed. And he straps down everything that can fly around. Then he goes out and he ties a windsock to the tail of this aircraft. So everybody can see you flying around that circuit, and the guy that's with a sock, he is a solo pilot, so everybody should stay out of his way. Then you go and do your landing, and if successful, the guys, your feet are not allowed to touch the ground. They pick you out, lift you out of the cockpit, your fellow pupils, and they carry you to a water hole that they've dug in the mud, and they dump you into this thing. Now, I must tell you, I went solo in the winter, and at De Notter, in the mornings, it's sub-zero temperature, so they had to break the ice crust that was on the thing before they dumped me in. So, yes, it was cold. But the feeling of elation that you had going solo, it made up for all of that. That is wonderful. But in any case, I completed the course successfully, the ground subjects. Not easy, about 14 subjects, different subjects, which each one you had to pass at 75% pass rate. Should you fail it, then you must rewrite it and get whatever you get, they will only credit you with 60%. So you need an aggregate of 75% to pass. So if you rewrite the subject, even if you get 100%, they will only give you 60% for that subject, but your aggregate must still be 75. And you're only allowed to fail 2 subjects. If you fail a third one, regardless, you are kicked out, and that's it. That's it. No amount of crying will ever get you back. You are off on your own. So, yes, the training was free. It didn't cost me a cent, except for lots of blood, sweat, and tears, for sure. But last time I took you right up to the end of the flying the old Harvard, a wonderful aircraft, absolute, the icon of flying. You can talk to any South African Air Force pilot, and they will almost talk with reverence about that aircraft. It was such a fantastic aircraft to fly. Difficult. You couldn't play around with it. If you treat it with respect, it would take you home. If not, it could kill you quite easily. But in any case, we got the wings. That was the end of 1972. So with the inset of 1973, I was posted to 42 Squadron, Potchefstroom, where we flew Cessna 185s. Now, Cessna 185 is you can call it a civilian aircraft. It's a tail dragger. In other words, it's got two front wheels and a little wheel at the back. So it sits on the ground at an angle of about 4 or 5 degrees, nose upward. Luckily, same as the Harvard, also tail dragger. But luckily, the Cessna did not have such a long nose because it had a smaller engine, little Continental engine. And instead of where the Harvard practically roared, the Cessna, had sort of a hoarse little whisper to it. It also smoked a bit on starting, but they looked real dainty little aircraft, flimsy little things. At that stage, they weren't camouflage yet. They were still silver, painted silver. And it really looked like a puddle jumper until you started flying that machine. It had spring steel undercarriage, bowed spring steel undercarriage, and if you put that aircraft down slightly too hard or slightly too slow or slightly too fast, those little spring steel would flex, and on return, it would kick you right back into the air and into the height of uncertainty where you didn't know whether you should go around or maybe just close the power slightly, push the nose forward. Normally, whatever you did was wrong, and you would jump down the airfield in ever-increasing bounds all the way down. In any case, the conversion course started early in January. On the 31st of January that month, my flying career almost came to an end. Myself and a guy called Saki Skeepers. He was my instructor at the time. We were flying, coming back from IF training sortie over near Parys in the Free State, when we were called back to Potch because of a nearing thunderstorm. In any case, we were below this thunderstorm, and people who know thunderstorms will know there's lots of updrafts and downdrafts in this thing. We got sucked right up into this thunderstorm, and then it started raining. And the amount of rain that clattered on that little flimsy aircraft, the noise, you cannot describe it to you. But the amount of rain was so intense that the engine cut out completely. So we lost the engine, probably at about 1,000 foot. And we never saw the ground again. We knew the ground was somewhere in front of us. Potch was somewhere in front of us, and we just carried on in that way. And at some stage, there was a small break in the cloud, and I looked down and I could see the firing range of Potch, the weapons range, the small caliber gun range. And I saw that and I knew we actually passed the airfield. And I turned around and I just completed. It's a stupid thing. You should not, when you haven't got the engine working, you should not turn around, but luckily I did. And the moment I almost completed the 180-degree turn, and I saw the trees just boom up in front of me. Pulled the flap lever and we crashed into this tree, almost sat down on the top of the tree, cushioned our fall, and the right-hand wing broke off. That was about the only thing, and it settled down nicely. We got out, then we had to run away from the lightning bolts. The lightning bolts was all over. We trundled around for a long time before we actually found the airfield. That's a long story. I told that whole story in a book. I'm not going to go into that. But in any case, that was the 31st of January. Started flying again after everything on the 7th of February. They didn't give me too long to think about it. And then we did all kinds of training. things that the civilians won't do, the military does. We did message pickups where you would lean out of this aircraft with a big grappling hook at the back, and whoever would give you the message, they would span this message between two poles, and you would hook this thing, pick it up. We did some rough landing. Littlefield Modderkop, where we used to do training on very short landing strips. We did Land Rover light landings. In other words, at night they would set up the Land Rovers cross beams, so we would land only in the light of vehicles. Then we went down to Oudtshoorn to go and do mortar. What do they call it? Lining. You know, the army would shoot the mortars. You would be in the air, and you would say, "Okay, bit more left, bit forward, etc., etc." We spent 2 weeks there, and after that, we were finally qualified as pilots. And I think it was about the 3rd of April of 73. I had to fly in Cessna up to Swartkops, where I had to go in what we used to call klaar in. You had to go and klaar in for the boss. I had to go and get my briefing there from, at that stage, it was still Brigadier Bob Rogers. He was not Chief of the Air Force yet. And a guy called Colonel Clemens. I'll talk about Clemens later on. Interesting old man. Became my neighbor as well at a later stage. But in any case, there they told us all the do's and don'ts about the bush. And that afternoon, I flew back to Potch, and the next morning I had to fly up to Rundu. And normally you would fly up with the Flossie, the C-130 would take the pilots on the changeover there. But in this case, there was an aircraft that was ran out of hours at Rundu, so I had to fly one up in its place. And I did it alone. It sounds strange at that stage, but suddenly, after all my navigation hours, etc., I was alone in a little Cessna flying to Rundu, and we were not allowed to fly over Botswana. So I flew to Keetmanshoop, where I refueled, and then on to Rundu. And in this whole time, you know, you wonder, you've heard such heroic stories about the young Fitzer. We call you know, at that stage, the guys that did all the flying in the bush was the Alouette pilots and the Cessna pilots, and here and there, a DAC pilot. So there was no other people. The Flossies, as I said, described when I was a navigator, they came in high and went out high, that type of thing. So they weren't flying around the bush as such. But we, the young guys, the Fitzer. Now, by Fitzer, the Fitzer we called, that was a second Lutz and a full Lutz. A second Lutz was a Dunwheel Fitz. And a full Lutz was a Dikwiel Fitz. The reason where the name Fitz came from, I don't know who coined the phrase in the first time. A bicycle in a sandy area, if it's got thin little wheels, it sort of plonks down and you had to trap hard. So you had to really step on a second Lutz to get anything going. The full Lutz had a bit thicker wheel. They were a bit better. The other ranks that we had on the border was captains. I'm talking about the flying crew now. The captain was a nice rank because you were too senior to do the menial works of the Fitzer, and you were too junior to do the senior work. But in any case, I break the point. I went up to Rundu in that Cessna and worried all the way, worried there. How will I cope? How will I be fighting? This is now the first time that I'm going to be low level in the bush. I was there on the C-130s as a nav, but normally with a full complement of about 92 troops in the back. Now I was going to be mostly on my own. In any case, I got there almost at dusk about, and I was welcomed by the other Cessna pilots. We were normally 4 pilots, 3 at Rundu. The other one was at Serpa always. I'll talk about that. In any case, the 3 guys met me there, plus the chopper guys that was there, and I was escorted to the Jakkalsgat. Now, just a quick knockdown on the Jakkalsgat. I'll probably talk more about it at a later stage. the Jakkalsgat was the main place in Rundu. It was a big sort of semi-permanent building with canvas. That building, the front part was the movement control where the troopies cleared in. It was the place where you get your inoculations and etc. etc. It had sections that could be removed, and they opened it up to be a bit of a hall where they had entertainment whenever there was a visiting entertainment group would be there. And the back part it was the pub. That's where we spent all the time, bearing in mind there was no telephones, we had no cameras, we weren't allowed to have cameras so there was very little in terms of entertainment. So the pub was a main area, and there we played games like who could put the cookie in the cookie jar and dead ant and all kinds of, maybe talk about this. But it was a wonderful place. And then, by the way, Sundays, that whole area was converted into the area we had our church services. I distinctly remember guys like Dominee de Beer, and there was an English guy, a Padre Moore, a wonderful guy. But in any case, so the Padre Moore, Saturday nights, he would come into our pub and sit there and drink a Coke with us while we were drinking a bit harder stuff. And at the end of the evening, he would say, well, I've been to your church now. You will come to my church tomorrow. So, and without fail, he got us there. But the flying at that stage, mostly, I think Chris talked about it, for a long time, the police were basically in charge in the bush. The army was actually almost confined to base in most places. The police were walking the patrols, etc., etc. And I worked a lot with the police. I really did. On those trips, I met guys that became friends. Well, couldn't say really friends. They were so senior to me. I'm talking about a guy like old Brigadier Bert Wandrag. And he had a captain with him always, a Captain Swart, a big guy. I flew Wandrag around a lot. There was a couple of trips that I did with Wandrag and this captain where it was sort of unscheduled and uncleared, but we flew to certain areas to go and look who was doing what on the ground. And sometimes we even interfered with it, but I'm not going to talk about that too much with the Cessna. Yeah. So in any case, those were the good old days. What more I can say about Rundu is the pets that we had there. Ballas the cat. Talk about. There's a whole story about Ballas. He was the sultan. All the other cats was his concubines. And those were the days where spoonerisms was very popular. And old Chris Hartzenberg gave this one cat, it was a black cat. That was Ballas's favorite concubine. He called this cat cooking fat because of the spoonerism. You can work it out. But in any case, so that was Rundu or on Cessnas. The end of the next year, I think it was 74, we got the Bosbokke and the Kudus in, and they became 42 Squadron. They were also sent to Potch, so Bosbokke and Kudus were stationed at Potch. And we that were on Cessnas, our squadron was changed in name to 11 Squadron. So we suddenly became 11 Squadron without really a posting as such. So at Potch, I had 2 squadrons, 42 and 11 Squadron. And then 74 as well, that was my first trip. Now, Rundu, we called Rundu the trips there, the bush tours, Ops Polo. And those were the days when they brought out the Pro Patria medal for the guys in the bush. Now, the original idea of the Pro Patria medal was you had to do service on the other side of the red line. Not just in Southwest, it had to be on the other side, which was the old Setsi control line that ran almost through Sumep, about that area. So if you were north of that, you were eligible to earn that. And the other thing that they said at that stage, you had to do a minimum of 8 weeks continuous service, otherwise you could not get the Kunene or the Pro Patria. So, in any case, I qualified for that within my first bush tour at that area. And I did, I think, 3 more in that area that year. And the next year we went to you had to do 3 Southwest bush tours on the Cessna before you could go to Rhodesia. So next year, Rhodesia was called Ops Rumpus. So my next tour was to Rhodesia. After this was in 74. Now to go there, we had to fly from Potch to Pretoria and go and klaar in at Wagtehuis, the police big place, Wagtehuis in Pretoria. There we were issued with police uniforms, shoes, weapons, the beautiful P38. I love that P38. It was the loveliest pistol to handle. It just felt like a natural aiming pistol. I loved it. But the other part that I didn't love was this Hamka that they gave us, a Heckler and Koch. I think it's a collapsible submachine gun. A dangerous thing. You drop that thing, it went off. But that's another story. But in any case, then we went to Rhodesia. Okay, but, sorry. Let's just get back to Rundu quickly. Our tours at Rundu, the bush tour, we were normally 4 pilots in that area. 3 always operating in the Rundu area up to Katima, all over. And one of them would be sent over into Angola for 2 weeks. Serpa Pinto, now called Munangi. In any case, there you would operate in Portuguese uniform. So, interesting trips there, very interesting trips. I've written a couple of stories about that. Amongst others, I had a Portuguese major flying. He couldn't speak English, but he had a lot of Bacasera. I think, no, Aquardent. Aquardent was the liquor that they drank. You could smell it. It was a summer, and he parked a cat in my, you know what I'm talking about. He parked a cat all over the dashboard of my Cessna. I had to fly. The Cessna had little windows that you open on the side, and I had to stick my head out to the side looking, because that smell was horrific. Until I had to go and land at a place called Lupiri, and looking in front, Lupiri was number 1, a challenging runway, because it was looking like Swartkops, except in the reverse. You landed low with a hump, and you always thought you were short, and then you go over the hill, and there's still some runway left. But in any case, when I had to look forward, there was a piece of bacon, probably about 6 inches long, draped over my throttle. That's where I also lost it. But in any case, that's a different story. But then, as I say, we went to Rumpus, Rhodesia. Also, always 4 Cessna drivers in Rhodesia on rotation. I started in Gweru. That's one place. There's more in the southern part. You do 2-week stint there, and then you would move up to Wangi. Some people call it Wanki. There you would 2 weeks, and then you would go to Kariba itself, 2-week stint there, and then a 2-week stint at Salisbury. And bear in mind, that was 1974. And what's very nice about Rhodesia, we lived in the offices there. We didn't live in tents. In Rundu, we lived in tents. Rhodesia, we lived in the offices mess. And you had the Rhodesian mess was different from ours. The batman would come and visit you. If you're not flying, they would say, okay, what time do you want to eat? You would say 7 o'clock, and says, what would you like? And you would say, okay, steak, medium rare, etc., etc. It was real, I would almost say, English traditions. The Rhodesians were very, very sophisticated, old chap. You know, they were, But wonderful. Another thing that was wonderful, obviously, we didn't have television in South Africa yet. I think our television only came in 1975 or 76. Those days we watched television there, and not much of a television if I really think about it. But it was interesting, two of the presenters that regular was Michael de Morgan, I'll never forget his name, and a woman by the name of Donna Wursel. And they both later worked for the SABC. So they were our presenters once we got television. But Rhodesia, they shot at you a bit more, picked up a few bullet holes at places like Shirundu, picked up bullets right over Harare. Not me, my aircraft, luckily. Also not seriously. I did a forced landing at a place called Kenyamba. I did a forced landing, lost an engine there, and made it back safely. Kenyamba was an interesting place. Also, the SAP was there. We went up as SAP, as I said, SAP uniforms, but our SAP were there. They had boats on the river. This is now in the Zambezi River. Boats without propellers. They had air drives or water drives. And it's quite speedy things. And obviously somebody was bored and they started this trend of skiing. But we didn't have skis, so it was knotty point planks that was banged into tackies. And those you strapped on and you skied. It wasn't very graceful, but you had to stay up top because there was a lot of crocodiles and hippos around, so you didn't want to bugger around with those boys. But in any case, interesting times. Yeah. We did some funny things. You know, if you're young, you feel you are indestructible and nothing could happen to you. I can remember even in Angola, in Serpa Pinto, myself and a guy called Tinus Brown, we made a canoe, homemade canoe out of corrugated iron. And we launched that thing. We called it the SS Serpa or SS Pinto, I can't remember which. We launched it into this fast-running river, the Quebe. And from Serpa Pinto, we rode down to, there was a leopard colony about 20 kilometers down the river. Only place where the cars could get back to us. We rode down that river. And then at one of the big openings in the river, there was a crocodile that I thought it attacked us. It jumped off the rocks into our direction, but it probably just tried to get away. Our canoe was busy started sinking, because it was open, so it was every now and then it would fill of half full water and we'd go to the side and empty it. And I didn't wait for it to sink. I jumped overboard and swam out. Tina said my back wasn't even wet when I got to the other side. So yeah, there we emptied and we had to row further. But that's the sort of things that you did, you know, onverantwoordelijk. But when you were flying professional. Make no mistake. So that was my Cessna tours. And I think about mid 75? No, mid 76. I was posted to DAX, do the DAC conversion at Bloemspruit. So I started flying DAX there. And then about October, we were posted to 44 Squadron in Pretoria. That was just the start of Op Savannah. And flying was at premium. We used to fly a lot. I got home, myself and my wife, my late wife, we were in the process of buying a house. We signed for the place. And then suddenly this call came. I had to go to the border and fly. Don't know how long or whatever. Long story short, I came back, I think it was end of February, and was involved going out all the way up in Angola, Nagage, places like that, flying troops and Casevacs. Initially, I was only supposed to fly a photo deck, and that soon fell by the wayside. The photo deck is also a different story. We were doing infrared photography at night from 1,000 foot, which was in Afrikaans, to call it in Afrikaans, was regte kaksoekvlugte daai, because they would shoot at you. But in any case, we had to do that, otherwise the infrared line scan didn't work properly. Had to be very accurate flying. So we had the first, call it the first in South Africa, the first advanced GPS thing wasn't GPS, it was called VLF. Big. It's antennas on the roof and a big, almost the size of a big suitcase. That was, nowadays the GPS is you hold in your hand, but that's the way it started. In any case, I did quite a few deck tours, also into Rhodesia. Once again, Rhodesia, strangely, I never picked up holes in Angola or Namibia, but I've again picked up holes in the aircraft over Rhodesia. They were shooting a bit more that side, but Rhodesia had its better side as well. Also, when I was at 44 Squadron, I got involved. I was the first guy myself, and Andre Dreyer was the first guys to fly the Spook. The Spook is a 4-engine Skymaster, big aircraft. We used to call it the Dakota Station Wagon. It had 4 big radial engines. It could stay well. We actually did stay in the air once for 13 hours. So you could really keep it in the air for a long time. We would trundle up and down on a border. This aircraft could pick up electronic transmissions from radars and even voices and everything, the whole spectrum. And we flew that first sortie was with Kasinga. I saw the Battle of Kasinga from the air. We were not supposed to be there. We were supposed to be patrolling up and down, but there was a deck designated to be the Telstar for Kasinga. And at the, Murphy's Law, at the perfect moment, the deck went unserviceable and we had to take over. And because we were on a different mission, we did not have the codes and the things that they used for Kasinga. So we sat in the air, although we saw the attack. When they started picking up problems, they were talking in strange language. And we said, okay, we hear you've got problems. Tell us what your problem is. And they asked us, haven't you got the comics? And Andre Dreyer, he was the commander at that stage. I'll never forget that. He could speak very fluently in the other language. And he just said, man, F and comics, lots of stories. He says, if you want our help, now you speak plain and we will help you. We were orbiting, then we had to climb up to 17,000 feet without oxygen to establish decent communications with Oshikati and Kasinga. And we were relaying messages. Andre actually sent in the Buccaneer. He was never credited for that, but he sent in the Buccaneer, Dries, and because Dries said, well, he had the weapons, and Andre said, well, I give you permission to attack. So yeah, that's a long story, but I've written that story as well. Then a couple of stories. After that, I became Mr. Spook. Every time the Spook flew, I flew. And quite a few interesting escapes. I had once near the Marienflush, other side of Kaluek. I was intercepted by a MiG at night. And this guy was on the verge of shooting us down. We had a lock-on. They showed the lock-on in the aircraft already. And that night I did an emergency descent, a dive. Man, I tell you, it was crazy. We actually recovered, once we passed 8,000, we dove down from 11,000. Once we passed 8,000 foot to recover that aircraft, it was quite something. And the high ground around us was more than 7,000 feet high. We actually pulled out about 1,500 feet below the tops of the mountains. And it was at night, we couldn't see them. So we pulled out, the angels were sitting on our shoulders. Myself and Charlie van Weingart on that trip. And then wragtig, a week later, we got intercepted again. Almost shot down again, this time by our own forces, our own Mirages. But yeah, in any case, that was another story. Also told, written about. But yeah, the Skymaster, wonderful, wonderful times in the Skymaster. I had definitely, I think, the most hours on that aircraft, far more than 1,000. But wonderful times, good times, big crew where you're sitting with about 19 to 20 guys in the back. You and your co-pilot, the engineer, and then the two leaders, Johan Lourens, Major Johan Lourens, and Warrant Officer Phil Darville. They were always with us. So about every spook trip, they were also with us. So we got to know each other very well. But then from there, that was 44th Squadron. Then in 2000 and not 2000, 1988. End of 88, I was posted to 28th Squadron, flying C-130s again, this time as a pilot. Interesting trips on the C-130s. I love the C-130, but make no mistake, there's nothing that came close to the Dakota and the Skymaster for me. The Dakota, I've written a story about how you became one of with that aircraft. If it rained, you got wet. If it was cold, you froze. If it was hot, you suffered. But what an aircraft. You had no navigation equipment except about the B-16 compass, the old whiskey compass as we call it. We had to navigate on the border by sight, map reading. And if you know the border area those days, the trees, every one of them, the dense trees, they would grow up to almost exactly the same height. But here and there would be one that stuck out maybe 6 inches or a foot higher than the other ones. And those trees you learn to recognize. And you navigated by this. I remember once flying, we had a Chinese, Taiwanese, or what do they call them, Nationals China, a couple of those guys that came to view our operations in the bush. And I still got the medal of this guy gave me, just not a medal, a gong like we have, almost a coin, General Ma'anlan. He gave me this coin. He said, how do you guys navigate here? How do you know where you are? So I don't know. We know. He said, it's amazing, dude. But, of course, if I can say to you this, we were good. Man, there's a lot of civilian pilots that I've got a lot of respect for. But these days, I tell you now, civilian pilot, you take away his GPS, he is buggered. They will not be able to do what we did. How we did it, I don't know. I really don't know. But it was dedication, and we never, I can't remember that I ever got lost or anybody really got lost. It's just incredible. In any case, we went to C-130s, as I say. The C-130 was more like a computer game. The C-130 was very high servo assisted. You had very little feel on the aircraft. You could move that thing easy. With a Skymaster, if you wanted to turn, you had to, you had to really put effort in it. It gave you feedback, the deck as well. It gave you feedback, where I think the C-130 did not give me that amount of feedback. But we did some interesting trips. I did more night flying trips than I did day flying trips on the C-130, because those were the days when we would go and deliver for our friends in both Angola and in Mozambique. We used to have these pallets with big parachutes, and we would at night go and do low-level parachute extraction flights. Once again, cockpit, but yeah, it's a different story. We can talk about that at a later stage. So I flew those for quite some time, and then my late wife got cancer, and I had to take myself basically off flying. And I spent some time at Air Force headquarters. And I had two kids, 3 years and 11 years. I had to look after. In any case, that was quite a tough time, and I spent time at Air Force headquarters, where I became the editor of the Air Force magazine called Nyala, the safety magazine. So I wrote a lot of stories there, and maybe that's where I started discovering that I could read or write a bit of stories, which I said I'm writing stories, but in any case, that's maybe where I discovered I could do that. In any case, I spent some time there, but then eventually my wife died. And I just had this drive. I was not interested in rank or anything. I wanted to fly. And the only way to get back to it was to go and do instructor's course. So I volunteered for instructor's course. And to this day, it was probably the most difficult course that I've ever done in my life, in terms of I had such a lot of flying hours at that stage. I had more than 9,000 hours already, and I knew aircraft. I thought I knew everything about aircraft. But on instructor's course, they've got to teach you how to teach people what you know. Now, lots of things in flying eventually becomes almost reflex. When you turn, when you go into a turn, you use a certain amount of rudder. How much? Who knows? You just keep the aircraft balanced. But when you have to tell this to another guy, how do you turn? You turn, So instructor's course, they have to break you down to the basics again, so that you understand the aerodynamics in it. And yes, I eventually did. And I think I eventually became a pretty good instructor. I think so. But yeah, it was a difficult course in the other respect, because I had all the experience, and the guys that were teaching me was juniors. Guys with virtually no experience. Guys that some of the instruments that we had to learn on our basic course, these guys have never seen. I've used them. So that was one of the things that you had to bite your tongue sometimes and not say to the guy, no, you're talking a bit of a lolly here, this thing works like that. But you don't tell that to an instructor, you just shut up and do. I was over 40, I think I was 42. Other guys was here in the early 20s when they were giving me instruction, which was another, I would say, anomaly, really. In any case, after that, I just had to send 2 pupils solo. Then I would become a BCAT, and they wanted me to go to multi-engine instructor's course, which is at Bloemfontein. So after I sent my 2 students solo, I went to Bloemfontein and there at 86 and gave instruction there. And then I think I was there for 2 years. Then they posted the OPSCO. The OPSCO is sort of the 2IC of the base. So I became OPSCO at Bloemspruit. While still giving instruction on DAX and also on the 2 commando is a resident commando in squadron, so 105 and 107. The one was based at Uppington. The other one is based in Bloemfontein. So I did a lot of civilian flying, giving instruction on Cherokees and Cessna Senecas, Pipers. Flew a hell of a lot of civilian aircraft. It was a good time. It was an interesting time. But then I think it was, was it 91? Lesotho bought 2 CASA aircraft. And typically it's a financial thing. The Spanish just trained them almost to fly. And those guys, some of those guys never flew even bicycles. So the aircraft was in Lesotho, and I think a week after they got the aircraft, they crashed the one in the mountain with, I think it was 28 people killed at Katja's Neck. And then the Lesotho government asked our government if there is not an experienced pilot that can come to them. So I volunteered for that. And eventually I spent 6 years in Lesotho flying the CASA. First went to Spain to do the conversion for the other CASA that I had to bring back. Then brought the CASA here through Africa. What was interesting about this, I almost say the old days dirty tricks department. I still have here in my pub, I'll show it to you. I've got a passport that says I was born in Lesotho, Mosira, Lesotho. So, yeah. And I went through Heathrow, of all places, where, the Heathrow, the customs there was these Sikhs, guys with the moustaches and these turbans around their heads. And those guys were full of shit, eh? They looked at my passport and they said, okay. My co-pilot that I took along was a guy called Ntabi. He was a real Basotho. So they looked at his passport and said, come here. And had him into a place where they gave him a 3rd degree. So eventually I said to him, when he came out, he was white. And I said to him, see, hey, you think we South Africans are racist? Look at those guys. But, yeah, in any case, I spent 6 years on CASAs, and I flew them, very interesting, flew them all into Africa, deep places in Africa, Malawi, etc., and back to Lesotho. So lots of interesting stories I can tell you about that. But then at the end of that, that was, I think, 97, my tour finished there. Then the Air Force, in all their wisdom, they said they needed to send somebody else, must also get a chance in Lesotho. I said, you will get nobody, because first, you don't get any extra. I got no extra pay, even though I worked in cities and fell under the embassy, I got no extra pay. I said, you won't get anybody else, because they had to, wherever they are, they had to move there. I didn't. I rode a car every day from Bloemfontein to Mosira and back. But it was a Basotho car. They gave it to me, so I did 300 kilometers every day, early morning in, afternoon out. But I said, I don't think you'll get any, which happened to be true, because I was then the last guy to do that, South African guy. I was posted back to Bloemspruit as efficiency coordinator, base efficiency coordinator, which was, well, at first they wanted to post me to some other place. I said, but in any case, the end of the year, I'm going to take a package, which I did. So I left the Air Force the end of 98. Sad farewell, but then the old enemies was the new bosses at that stage, and I wanted to avoid the Okangera war trials, but in any case, so I left the Air Force and went to Plet. I bought a little farm in Plet, a little small holding, and I farmed with parrots. I bred parrots, 76 breeding pairs, from macaws down to African greys, lots of Amazons, galahs. Did very well. Did quite well with my parrots. Never lost a parrot, but then the bird flu broke out in the country, and still did not ever lose a parrot, but I lost my markets. I couldn't export, so every year I had to build more cages, etc., and it was just overflowing eventually and they eat a lot, they cost a lot to maintain if you have such a lot. So I was lucky then, developers bought my small holding. They were very interested. I got 10 times more than I paid for it. I only paid 200,000 for it, so I got 10 times more. And that's when I bought the place in Still Bay. I sold a bit of real estate on a sideline. I did quite well with that, but then a friend of mine phoned me from Spain, and he said they are looking for instructors at the flight school. And to make a long story short, they did a telephone interview. We did not have something like the Zoom yet. It was pure telephone interview. And the guy said, well, you sound okay. Come up and we'll give you a 3 months probation. And bearing in mind at that stage, I was almost 8 years out of flying, really, out of instruction. I really had to work my butt off. Also, my wife said to me, you're not going alone. I also want to go. But it was on my ticket. Spanish didn't pay anything. I had to go there. And if I made it, then I would start earning money. But it was a hell of a chance that I took. But in any case, we went there and eventually we stayed there for almost 8 years. And wonderful. Had wonderful experiences, toured Europe quite a lot. But then my wife wanted to come back because there's, omas and grandmother feeling, the grandkids is growing up and she wanted to see them. So we came back and I said, well, being the pigment that I've got and being the age I am, so I turned 60 when I went to Spain. Turned 60 already. I turned 60 in Spain. So I said, no. I was 58 when I went there. Any case, but I turned 60 there. I said, well, I'm not going to get another job. So I came back and I thought, well, okay, this is it. I'll have to start selling houses again. But I was only 2 months back when iPhone phoned me and said they need an instructor there, the Chinese school. So I went to Oudtshoorn, George, and Beaufort West, and that's where my flying or my career in aviation, the last part of it, I was just giving ground instruction. I was probably the only guy that gave instruction or taught all the Air Force subjects, everyone. And I was cleared to do that by the UK CAA, because while I was in Spain to teach there, you fell under the UK CAA, and they, for every subject, new subject, they would come and send their writers or whatever you call them, and you would have a lecture session, and then they say, okay, you're okay, you can do that. The other thing that I had, I am a language tutor, ICAO, qualified ICAO, which was quite interesting. I've got a level 6 ICAO certificate, which even the English, when we were in Spain, myself and my friend Vic Swanepoel, ook 'n boertjie, Afrikaner, we were the only two. Even the English couldn't get level 6. They got level 5. But if you listen to them, you must listen to a Welshman and a Scotsman and even an Englishman from Liverpool area speaking. You can't understand them. So we got level 6s in their language and they could only get level 5s. So yeah, that was another story. Okay, that in a nutshell is the whole of my career. But there's a lot of very interesting incidents that I had somewhere along the line.
Yeah, we definitely gonna get to those interesting parts as well, because now we basically introduced you to our viewers, and I'm sure they have a lot of questions as I do. It's a funny thing. My wife, of course, has a language schools herself in Switzerland. I think it's English, French, Spanish, and German, which they teach the people there. I could never quite understand why these Europeans cannot speak English. Mind you, they
But,
say I can't speak it either. So,
but I must say to you, the thing is, the English that I did, or the valuation that I'm doing, it's not the writing and the nothing about that or grammar. It's the clarity. Now, for some reason or other, Afrikaans guy speaking English is apparently the clearest pronunciation of words. Maybe not in the rights, but as I say, you go and listen to a Liverpudlian pronounce something, and it's all to do with aviation English. In other words, the guy sitting in the tower speaking to somebody in the aircraft, can they understand each other? So this is where it comes from. It's not that I'm a linguist or anything like that.
yeah, I think for the aircraft crew, it is English. Pommy Hooligan is actually the language they speak.
Yeah, it is.
And
International.
we've got a problem here where I live, where apparently quite a few pilots are not that proficient in the language, and they get into trouble when they do international flights. And then it came out a whole bunch of them actually qualified somewhere in India, but they sort of never qualified. I don't want to go into that, but apparently some of these flight schools are not really reputable places, which scares me actually. But then,
This is a thing, Chris. In Spain, we had a language section that actually taught the guys. If the one thing we taught in English in Spain, it was an English flying school. So the guys would get there, and me as instructor giving lessons, and I say, no, this guy doesn't understand me. I would toss him. He would drop out of the ground phase for 2 weeks, intense English, and so on. And this is also here at Oudtshoorn, because we had Chinese guys now, and we had to teach them English. And the funny thing is, we also had African guys from Kenya. We taught a bunch, but man, they speak English like the prince. They speak real Pakajan, very, very good English. So we never had problems with them. But the Chinese, they had to get at least a level 4. And this is ICAO standard. Everybody, whether he's Russian, Chinese, or whatever, if he flies aircraft, he must have at least a level 4 proficiency in English. But in any case, that's just by the by.
it's fascinating to me that you say this, because you people might not understand this, but I don't really know what the guest is going to tell me beforehand. I might have an idea, but I'm not. And so last time we were in South Africa, we actually slept over at Beaufort West on the way to Cape Town. And somebody, I think it's Colonel Sieberts, actually arranged for Rebecca and myself, my wife, to go and look at the school, which we have here at Beaufort West. Now, we were not allowed to take pictures or anything, but I can tell you, I was very impressed with what I saw there. These people were, man, it was run like, I would say, an old Air Force base. Everything was neat and orderly. And
when you say that, Chris, but it was run by the Air Force. I mean, Picky was there, I was there, Christa Stribble was there. I can name you all the instructors, basically, the senior instructors was Air Force. So it was the same thing in Spain when I was working there. The instructors at this civilian school was ex-Air Force, either RAF or South African. So this is I don't know, there's quite something to say for for the Air Force, be it as it may. We get the job done.
No,
But
it's true. The Air Force, it's a highly professional organization. It's different. I suppose you can take anybody, and I'm not looking down on the Pongos in the army, not at all. No, don't put words in my mouth. But you cannot take a guy out of school and put him in an aircraft and think he's going to fly. He needs training. He needs serious training. And then you can do it. But the training he gets must be very, very, very good. And you need to be merciless in washing them out. I once spoke to his Israeli officer. He was a general, brigadier general, one of the fighter pilot aces. Won't mention his name, wonderful fellow. And I asked that I said to him, now, how do you guys do it? And he says, well, the Air Force will get the first pick of any national serviceman. They pick and choose in Israel whoever they want first. And then the rest, I think the army came right at the end almost. They get what's left. And I'm not downing on anybody, really not. But you need skills. It's not a simple thing to service an aircraft. Which brings me to a question, sir. We've had many Air Force people here, and I got the feeling with them that the Air Force was very safety conscious. Now, when I say Air Force, I mean the old SAF, not today. I don't know much about today's Air Force. We're very, very safety conscious, but I also had the feeling, and I might be wrong, and perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, Commandant, but there was subtle pressure on the pilot to bring his aircraft home. And sometimes where other people might have landed or ejected and come back because of the sanctions and the scarcity of combat aircraft, they did take some chances.
I don't think there was a direct pressure, not from headquarters and say, you have to disregard safety issues to bring this aircraft. I don't think that was true. But every one of us flying, you realize that your aircraft was finite. It was not infinite. You have 30 of this, or you 10 of that, or 2 of this. If it's gone, it's gone, and we're not going to get another one. The Alouettes, for instance, I'll tell you, I heard somewhere, and maybe the Alouette pilots will tell you, that we have never lost a tail number. In other words, what I'm saying, there's Alouettes that's been written off, and they say if they can find the nameplate, the number, they will rebuild that Alouette around it. The guys could lay the frames, etc. So, yeah, a lot of the aircraft that was written off, the numbers was actually recovered. I checked through my logbooks. It was quite some time to do it. I've written down all the aircraft tail numbers that I've ever flown, and it's a hell of a lot. I flew more than 100 different Harvards alone, and you've seen the pictures, I think, on that one picture that, who was it? I think Walter Weiss, that one of your legacies, with that picture at the Notter with the banks and banks of Harvards parked on the hard stands. And those were the things that we had. We took pride in that. When you look at the base now, you walk in and you see a cigarette butt lying around. I cringe. The guys, we used to have chicken parades where the whole base, that is from the OC down, walked over that. You picked up papers, etc., because the place was neat. The OC would inspect. If he see a tile cracked, fix. You cannot let things neglect. The moment one tile breaks, next time it's 2, it just escalates. So, and it's not done these days. I talked about the officers' mess. I think you read that thing about the officers' mess. I cry when I read that, because what a wonderful building. What history. We have so much history. And maybe when you read my books one day, you'll see I love history. I really love history. That's why I also enjoyed Spain, because there's so much history. We had parties in a place called Berabers, where Julius Caesar also had parties. Spain, most of the Kaisers O'Neill and all those, most of those guys were Spanish or grew up in Spain or had spent time in Spain. So there's a lot of Roman history there, and I love it. You know, when you walk into this old, I love seeing old stuff and preserved old stuff. I love it. You go into my pub, take you one day into my pub. All my Air Force memorabilia is there. I'll maybe just flick the. I love my pub. I can sit in my pub and look at something, and I can remember stories from that. You know, and sometimes that's where my stories come from. It just kickstarts something again. I love it.
You mentioned General Wangedrag or General Wandrag. He was, of course, the head of a SAP coin when I was there. I know you had a son in the police, and he was famous, but he was a strict man, but a fair man most of the time. But there was another general there, I think he's still alive, De La Rosa, who we called the mal Portuguese, the crazy Portuguese.
I think I know of him, yeah.
Yeah, and he never looked like a general, you know. I say this with respect, but many general officers look quite plump, you know, like Napoleon types. He didn't look very fit people, but De La Rosa was very different. He looked very like a fit man. I found actually the army generals, most of them were fit people, look very well in uniform. And the police, not so much. But let me not start a war. Point I'm trying to tell you here is that but between the two of them, they actually once had a police base, coin base, actually moved because it was something like 6 yards to the east where it shouldn't have been, and they measured it against a tree. Well, so the rumors go. I wasn't there. It might even be a lie, but I don't know. Good story anyway. So the policeman went out and they dug the tree out and they dug it in again for the next inspection. So that they didn't have to move the entire base. Why I'm mentioning this to you, sir, is when you mentioned to me that you cringe when you see that cigarette butt lying there. I get the fear of God these days, even if I see some of these young punks have a hat on their heads and they start eating. Because they start looking around, where is the sergeant? That sergeant sees that guy. There's going to be real trouble, and I don't want to be close to that before I'm in trouble as well. That was the discipline of the old forces, wasn't it?
Yeah. Hey, you don't wear a hat indoors, not at all. And you don't salute without a cap on. You stretch, you know, that type of thing. But you talk about Wangedrag. He was also the guy that was in that Fox Street when the police, what was it, hostage taking. He was involved there. Now, I'll tell you, the time that I was on Cessnas, that's where I met him, and we got along so famously well that he said to me, you know, often when I fly to a place, and I said, if you fly to a place and you need transport, phone me, I'll get you transport. You know, and I've been at places where I phone him from Gatsrand to headquarters. If I get him in the Hande, he says, okay, you get a car. No, they looked after me. But once again, what comes around goes around. I used to treat everybody. The Navy, I had the Navy. I could get any car out of it. I could get more out of the other forces than I could get out of my own force. Really. But that just by the by. But that's the way. It was interesting. I worked in many, many different uniforms, and I enjoyed the people I worked with. And mostly, I really did. So, yeah.
It's a great pity to me that the Navy never really came to legacy conversations. And I want to invite all the naval people and the Marines. Please, guys, come and talk to us. It is important. We had Admiral Suderland on, and he was fantastic. We had that Johanna submarine of his. We had that as well. But I've heard somewhere that the Navy personnel are actually allowed not to salute you or something if they are standing with underneath an arch or there's something above their heads. I've heard some story about that, and I'm not sure if it's true, though. Do you know anything about their saluting habits? I know they salute different because their hands are dirty or something like that.
I don't know about it, but I'll check. I've got a friend here Well, he's also, you talk about losing your mind. I think he's getting to that stage. Nugget van Noordwijk, we were very good friends, and I flew him around. He was a commander, Navy commander, so he would know a lot. I'll go and try and ask him. The other guy I also know, he was a submariner. His father was a guy that sketched and wrote Adoonshulle. Remember Adoonshulle in die brandwag? Hannibal. He was a commander, naval. I haven't heard from him for some time, but I can get hold of him. We also were good friends. But I'll try and find out about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's a pity the Navy doesn't contribute here yet.
We've got such a proud history. I mean, I really love the Navy, man. I think they are cool people. My mother, of course, always wanted me to go to the Air Force. But the police, to me, was a good option at that stage. But I want to, and on a serious note here, so I need to ask you something which I've been asked many, many times by people. Please tell me, what do you mean, Air Force people, when they talk about Telstar?
Telstar is basically the command post, the airborne command post. In other words, you have an operation on the ground there, and you've got a command post here. They cannot talk to each other on their radio. So you have Telstar. Telstar started, I think there was a satellite called Telstar, which established communications, from this side of the earth to that side. Those will be times before they had multiple satellites. So that is the Telstar, basically. It is just a relay post. You sit there, you make. Normally you don't. You have sometimes a commander sitting with you, that can run the battle, but they also have needs input from the other side. But mostly, the guys on the ground, they can run the battle, but if they have problems, they got to work through the Telstar, or like airborne control. That's basically airborne assist, whatever we can call it. That's what a Telstar is in our terms.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Now we all know, and I hope those following us will understand the word Telstar, what it means. Which reminds me, we had a fellow here. Sorry, sir, I interrupted you.
No, I said, this is typically, we talk, and I say Telstar, and I think maybe people know. And yeah, it's good that you ask, and maybe that we explain it.
Yeah, if you people listening yet and you've heard a certain word which we use, which you don't perhaps understand, guys, please tell us. We will gladly inform you, because we know that you might only be looking here a few years from now, and we do not mind to inform you what we're talking, because we have our own language. There's really certain things in the military, like an OPI.
Same. The Air Force is the same. We have our own language. We would say the guy augured in, or he spun in. An auger is a corkscrew. If you auger in, you've had it. You're out of control. Or he's in a flat spin. You've heard on a flat spin. Now, an aircraft in a spin normally is controllable, but the flat spin is a lot more difficult to get out. You need a lot more height. So when he's in a flat spin, that's a serious problem. So there's a lot of Air Force slang. And if you're not, that's why I explained about the fietser, dunwiel fiets and a duckbill fiets. You know what? Because we talk a lot about fietser. That's just a rank, the junior rank, dunwiel fiets and then a duckbill fiets, bit more senior. But both of them, you've got to step on them to get them going. Yeah, so yeah.
I was wondering if those two ranks you're talking about, I mean, the dunwiel fiets and the duckbill, if that doesn't go back to the RAF, because they don't have ranks like us in those days. They had more like stripes, almost like a Navy type of thing.
No, it's got nothing to do with that, really, because when I was in Rhodesia, we wore the British ranks, if you can call it that, so I was a squadron leader on decks. But when I was flying Cessnas, I was still the SAP, a lieutenant in a SAP. But yeah, so no, it's not because of the stripes. It's nothing to do with that. I think this is a purely South African coin, or really, I think it came from the Air Force. I'm not too sure. Maybe even the Army. But I grew up, since small. Dinwiel fiets and a dipwiel fiets. And a dinwiel was a 1 pipper, dipwiel was 2 pips, and obviously a captain had 3 pips. So yeah, that's where it came from.
I think it was the late Colonel Jan Breitendag who said he did a parachute course in the US as a 1 pip second lieutenant, and they thought he was a 1-star general, actually. He probably abused that completely. I don't know if it's true, guys, But, so on a serious, we had a fellow here called Laurie Sochat, who was a very young Jewish boy, and he was involved in Savannah. And while he was, I believe, at Cerro Pinto, he took a picture of a C-130 coming in, but in front of him was it looked to me like a Cessna or something standing there. And that very, very same aircraft took off a few hours later with 2 SAF members and I think a member of the Army. And it was shot down or lost somehow and it crashed.
That was a SAF Air, wasn't that was a SAF Air aircraft. In fact, that particular aircraft had a very good friend of mine on board. He was a co-pilot, a guy by the name of Dorian Schoen. There's just some strange. Later, another C-130 was shot down. A guy called Johnny Wilkinson, also ex-SAF guy, also a good friend of mine. In fact, so good, I was guard of honor at his wedding. And he was shot down a couple of years after that. His wife never married again. But he had a son, and the son grew up, and he wanted to go and look for his dad in Angola, where his dad and his son was shot down and killed there as well. So one of those anomalies or sad things. Yeah, there was 2 SAF Air. It was not the normal C-130. They were called the L-100s, Hercules L-100. Longer one.
Yeah, I've flown in a few of them. They look slightly different. They don't have windows at your feet. They were the pilots. There's no window there, and I think something about the radios. I'm not sure it's technical. What's the difference between a C-130 proper and the L-100?
I think the L-100 also did not have the attachments for the rockets. We had the attachments for the rocket-assisted takeoffs, which we did a couple of times. Another interesting story to talk about. Not too many people that still remember that. And I don't think the L-100s had that. And I think they also had a bit of a limitation on their rear entry doors. If I remember correctly, they're not in a normal paratrooping because they weren't supposed to be paratrooping doors, but they had the same ramp, etc., etc. Yeah.
We should remember that episode, sir, because this is important. Because I know that the American Air Force at one stage did 2 strange things with the C-130. One, I know they landed by cargo parachutes at the back because the brakes has failed. Now, how we didn't tore the aircraft apart, I don't know, but I was told. And the other one is during that failed rescue of theirs in Iran, they wanted to land the C-130s inside. And I wish that you'd inside, like Swiss and binne in a soccer stadium. And they wanted to do that by having these rockets you talk about facing forward. And then they would create pressure, of course, in Newton's law, and this thing stops and just drops down. During their test phase, they actually they did that, but it fell. It started burning. The aircraft, the pilots, they had to run away, and the frame was lost.
They actually did that to go and rescue. It was in Jimmy Carter's time in America. They did those trials to go and rescue Americans that was taken hostage in Iran or Iraq, a country, and they actually claimed that they could make this thing almost land within a soccer field, you know, that type of thing, and take off again. But that aircraft crashed and burned. As you said, it did not work. You know, I flew C-130s, and the C-130 was one of the things that we were very afraid of. If you come back on the throttles on the C-130, you had what was a gate. It stopped, and then you had to lift them probably about that much and then pull it back further. Then the engines would go into reverse. Now, the reason why that gate is so you couldn't pull it, if you pull that thing into reverse in the air, you're going to tear this aircraft to pieces. It's going to, it's not, it's very dangerous. So, yeah. But, yeah, so there's interesting things about aircraft.
But you as a pilot, so you're in command. I mean, if you have a command pilot in the left seat in a non-rotary, not a helicopter, a fixed-wing thing, you're sitting there and you have command of this aircraft and you are in command, I suppose. My question to you is, seeing what we just spoke about, may you legally refuse to take off because there's something wrong with it, or refuse the mission perhaps because you think it's insane? How does it work in the Air Force?
Can I give you an example? I, at one stage, flew Nelson Mandela, and he wanted to go to a meeting. We were scheduled to a meeting at a place, and there was one hell of a thunderstorms in that area. Dangerous, dangerous, dangerous stuff. And it was not too long after the time that I had this mishap with my thunderstorm. You might not know about the emergency landing that I did with a Dakota in a watermelon patch. And he said I had to go there because it was a serious meeting. And I said to him, you know, we're not going in there. It's too dangerous. It's not worthwhile. And he said, but I must. And I said, well, you know, you can always go there again next week, but if we crash, you never go there again, you know, that sort of thing. So, yes, in certain instances, I also, who was it? Minister Pietie du Plessis. At one stage, he wanted to go into a place and said, not a damn, not going there. Also, I also refused, well, this wasn't really the Canary. You know who the Canary is. He was very much big friends with Boet Trotsky in Bloemfontein. And one day he had they did a big hunt there somewhere, and they shot a lot of springbuck. And these trucks, I had to fly him back to Pretoria, and these trucks with the springbuck carcasses arrived, and he said to my crew, load it. And I said, whoa, so you don't load that stuff into my aircraft? He said, no, it must go. It's, I think it was gifts for, also amongst others, for F.W. de Klerk. I said I couldn't care for who it is. You're not loading that into my aircraft. And he actually said to me, you'll hear from me. And I said, probably will. But harder gaat, and I said, okay. And I phoned Air Force headquarters immediately, and I said, he was still a deputy minister at that stage. And I said, I've got this guy. And he said, he threatened me. And I said, I'm not loading. There's bloody carcasses, man. And, you know, blood is a hell of a rust agent. And over and above hygiene, etc. And I said, this guy threatened me that I'll hear from him again. He said, General said to me, don't worry, you won't hear from him. So, yeah. Now, for sure, you've got lawful orders. If an order is not lawful, you can say not a damn. And ultimately, you as the commander of that aircraft is ultimately responsible for the safety of that aircraft. That's why I said to you also this story about Magnus and whatever. Bullshit. Bullshit immediately. It doesn't happen that way. Now, we've got lots of rules. In fact, we've got one of our books, LNU 82. Myself and a guy called Ut Creer and Colonel Paul Neusser. I think it was a guy, Buck Buchanan, was involved, and the Air Force lawman, what was his name? Leon Marais. We were involved. We rewrote, and that book is the Air Force Safety Manual. The Air Force we called it the Air Force Bible, what you can do and cannot do. And that thing was written. I was instrumental on well, I was tasked. I was a skeevy, the most junior, but I rewrote that book. And there's lots of, it tells you exactly what you can do and when you can't do it. I told the story about Eheki, the beginning of Eheki, where I flew in and we lost that engine. I gave you that story. I think I did. But in any case, that also, they had to get special permission to go overweight. I could say, yes, I'll do it. But I still had to get Air Force permission, which they got me to go overweight. Otherwise, I couldn't do it. You can't just, because that's illegal. They can really prosecute you for that.
We will not say anything about that Canary and Kudesa because we will use very foul language. And since you're an officer and a gentleman, so we will not do that. But all of you know what we're talking about. But anyway, I have a last question for you, basically, or more a confirmation. We had a fellow here, he was a flight engineer on the, also his work, I believe, Jacques Detoy. My wife called him Detoy because he speaks French. And Jacques said that this book, of the ones he was flying, had a huge oil tank, extra oil tank there, right to the left. If you walk into the door,
just behind the pilot, sir.
Yeah. So what's that about, sir? Why do you need extra oil?
Now, let me tell you about the Skymaster. That specifically was the only Skymaster that we had that extra oil tank. Now the Skymaster, like the DAC, it was old engines, it leaked oil. Now, as I say, that aircraft also had bigger fuel tanks, so we could keep it in the air for much longer than the normal Skymaster. It was designed that way because on the original, they used to belong to South African Airways, and they had the Boeing run to Australia, which went via Reunion, etc., etc. So those Skymasters was set up in case the aircraft, the Boeings had to go and land at Reunion or something, that these things could fly spares out to them, certain spares. So it was designed for longer range. Now, the reason why the tank, because the aircraft would lose oil. We used to have some people who would say you could always see where the Skymasters used to fly, the trail of oil over the ground. So the oil would reduce and it would burn a certain amount of oil. So then at a certain time, if you see the oil is low, you can pump from that oil tank out to the engines. So that's the reason for that.
I just want to say to you people listening here, if you go to Rand Airport, it's close to Benoni.
Many times.
Airways Museum is there. I'm wearing their shirt actually by chance.
They
have a DC-4 standing there. Had a name. We made videos on it anyway. Very beautiful aircraft.
That's a Flippy Vermeulen's aircraft. It's a silver one. It's Flippy Vermeulen's one. That actually, it's a whole story. Flippy actually had to come and learn to fly the aircraft again with our people because Flippy, never, when he went to Airways, they didn't have the Skymasters anymore. Flippy, I don't know exactly. Flippy started a year after me. I think Flippy started in 1968 in the Air Force now. And then he left soon after that and made a name for Flippy has flown everything in the airline. But in any case, he flies that aircraft and he's flown it up to Oshkosh. He had old John Travolta fly with him. And John Travolta is a big aviation buff. So that's the aircraft that stands there. flew into our servicing. Certain of our servicing was always done at Rand. So I flew into Rand quite a lot. In the old days, DAX and Skymasters. There's also one of our Boeing, the short Boeings, the condensed Boeing. What do you call it? The SP, the Boeing SP, the compact. It's also standing there. Yeah. So that one is there. And but you've obviously been to Swartkops, where most of our Air Force aircraft is.
I was there, sir. I was really, really grateful for the people who took us. We got an entire series. We also did it at the SAA Museum. I have both of those Boeings, the short one you talk about, as well as they say the short one actually still works. If we put a battery or something on it, it can start up. Once a month or something, they have like school kids there with engineers, and it comes to life. I don't know how to put it. The cockpit, the thing starts spinning.
Yeah, you can do that. But I don't think they'll start the engines anymore. You know, that thing has been stationary for a long, long time now. You can get the instruments alive, etc., to light up. But unlike the Shackleton, you know, when you look at the Shackleton in Cape Town, every now and then, it's a big song and dance when they start the engine of the Shackleton. People come and listen because you've got to listen to that. I wrote a story as well about the Shackleton when we were still pupils on NAV course. We did a survival course and sitting in a dinghy, and eventually a Shackleton with Chris Lombard, he was a pilot, he came and did the dinghy drop, and then he gave us a shoot up. Now, if you have not heard for Merlin engines crying, you have not lived. You don't know about aircraft. What a pleasure to hear that aircraft and see an aircraft like that. Man, the old engine sounds much better than jet engines. Let me tell you now. I love piston engines. They are great. But yeah, I can tell you music to our ears.
But do you actually hear me? Sitting there in the front with this thing on your head of your radio stick, can you actually hear your engines the way you say now, like a mechanic would listen to it, or you have a gut feeling there?
Oh yes, you know, this is the funny thing. Most of us my hearing a certain frequency is not so good anymore, but most of the old guys, you know, when you look at the headsets that we used to wear, I don't know, probably because we wore them so long and you take it off and put it in the sun and the earpieces bake hard. So there's gaps. So, but even with the full headset, you still hear your engines. You know, you can have your full headset on and I will hear you speak. If you speak next to me, it's just, it tends to stop harsh, sudden noises like a bang. You know, if somebody shoots a pistol next to your head, it will diffuse that, but you can still hear voices. So it's not that deafening. But yeah, you hear the aircraft, and when you've flown as many hours on decks as I have, and the deck sitting right next to your engines, you hear them. But to me, they purr. They like kittens. I love them. It's yeah. You know, I often say, and I hope this is not blaspheme, but I hope that one day I will get a deck up there just to fly now and then. I really do. So yeah.
Well, that's a wish which I really hope is fulfilled. There's a lot of pilots, well, even us who were never there as pilots, you know, when we hear those decks and things, they do bring good memories to me. They smell differently, though. So the funny thing about it, they never smelled the same, the decks and the C-160s and the C-150s. They had different smells.
No, for sure. And the other thing about the deck, you know, we had the sliding windows in the front here. And when we used to smoke, you'd open that window slightly, but every smell at the back gets drawn through that. So if a guy farts in the back, you're the first to know about that. You know, they come right under your nose. So which was a bit of a bugger. I remember one trip that myself and Jannie Jacobs, we had to go at what was the place? It was Upur. There was two civilians that ran over a landmine, and not at Upur, but we had to fly them from there. They were from Rooikop. We had to fly them, and they only found them about a week after they died in this explosion. And I tell you, the smell in that cockpit, even though they were in lead, so-called lead cases, but those lead cases, the guys used to load them, throw them, they would bend and warp and what have you, and so on. With a bit of smells leaking out. So I still say, and I flew lots of dead people in my time. There's nothing that smells like a dead person. It's not nice. Dead animals, I've seen lots. Grew up on a farm, so yeah, not a problem. But dead people, they have a very, very distinct smell. So yeah, let's not go into that.
That's what I keep on saying to people, if you stand at a crime scene, Hollywood can show you the blood, the glory, gory, whatever, they can do that, but the smells are very, very real. And you pick it up. But I have to say now to all of you out there, guys, we've been speaking more than an hour and a half. It feels like 5 minutes. I can hear Rebecca, my wife, is back from the beach. It's a joke between the commandant and myself because he came to greet him and then she went to the beach. Now I can hear her chatting away here in the background, so I have to go. So thank you so much. Thank you for your time and coming to us. I really, really appreciate you. Our deepest condolences to the loss of your wife, even though it's long ago. We know how that feels. And to the rest of you guys, please come and talk to me. Don't think you don't have a story. Please come and talk to us so that we can get the picture together, so that people in the years to come can look at this instead of going on to Wikipedia or one of those liberal left-wing talk type of things, and they get the total wrong impression of you. Please come and talk to me. Contact me. It's not difficult. I'm sure a commandant will tell you. All you need to do is, even if you're not computer literate, man, don't worry about that. It is a simple process. Come and talk to us. Don't waste time. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. So until we meet again, God bless.
Greetings, folk. Dag sê. Thank you for joining me here for a very, very quick one. Koos and Rebecca have graciously invited me to leave you a link, wherever we put the link, to my Buy Me a Coffee page. Yes, please, if you're happy with the edit of this, or if I occasionally host a video, I'd appreciate your feedback and or you buying me a coffee, a beer, a glass of wine, or even maybe a small whiskey. But I'm going to categorically state, for the Legacy Conversations where this gets used, all that money is going to be reserved for a very special project, of which you will hear all about soon. So thank you very much. I do appreciate your contributions. Thank you, Donkey. Bye.
Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell to receive notifications.